This episode was produced using AI-generated voices and scripting. Okay, so the weirdest thing about this deal isn't the price tag. It's not even that SpaceX is buying an AI coding tool. It's that everyone keeps calling this an acquisition when it literally isn't one yet.
That's not what's happening. And I think the distinction matters way more than people realize. SpaceX hasn't bought Cursor. They've secured the right to buy Cursor. It's an option. It's structured so the deal closes later this year, contingent on SpaceX's IPO actually going through. Which, look, probably happens, but probably is doing a lot of work in a sentence about $60 billion.
60 billion for a company that, what was Cursor's last private valuation?
About $9 billion. Their last funding round had them at $9 billion. So SpaceX is paying roughly a 6.5 times multiple on the last private mark, which sounds insane until you remember that Cursor's annualized recurring revenue is north of 500 million and reportedly growing triple digits year over year.
Okay, but hang on. 120x revenue multiple? Even for AI, that's aggressive.
It is aggressive, but this isn't a normal M&A deal and SpaceX isn't paying cash. The whole thing is stock-based tied to SpaceX's IPO valuation. So the real question isn't whether 60 billion is a lot of money. It's whether SpaceX shares at the IPO price are worth what everyone thinks they're worth. And that's where it gets interesting because SpaceX's debt jumped to $23 billion last year.
Wait, seriously? 23 billion in debt?
Yeah, up from about 12 billion the year before. A lot of that's Starlink capex, Starship development costs, the usual SpaceX stuff. But when you're about to do what the bankers are calling Project Apex, this massive IPO, and you're simultaneously committing 60 billion in stock to acquire a startup, the balance sheet starts to matter.
So, who are the bankers? Because this thing has fingerprints all over it.
Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley are leading. Bank of America is in there, a few others. It's the full prestige lineup, which tells you the fee pool on this thing is enormous. Project Apex is expected to value SpaceX somewhere north of 350 billion, possibly 400. At that level, a 60 billion stock deal for Cursor it's material, but it's not bet the company.
It's like 16% of the company.
Give or take, yeah, significant dilution. And nobody's saying this. The Cursor founders and early investors are essentially betting that SpaceX public equity is going to hold or appreciate. They're not getting cash, they're getting shares in a rocket company.
That's the part nobody talks about. Like, if you're an early Cursor investor and you put money in at a $9 billion valuation, you're now sitting on paper that says you've got a 6x return, but it's all in SpaceX stock that you probably can't sell for some lockup period after the IPO.
Exactly. And the lockup is reportedly 6 months. So you're a Cursor investor, you've got this incredible return on paper, and you just have to hope that SpaceX stock doesn't crater in the first 6 months of public trading, which, I mean, it's SpaceX, it's probably fine, but probably fine and guaranteed liquidity are very different things.
Alright, let's get to the part I actually care about. Why does SpaceX want a code editor? Like, I get that Cursor is the hot AI coding tool, developers love it, it's got this incredible growth rate, but SpaceX launches rockets. What's the strategic logic here?
So this is where you have to stop thinking about SpaceX as a rocket company and start thinking about it as the Musk infrastructure layer. SpaceX has Starlink, global internet connectivity. XAI has the Memphis supercluster, which is one of the largest GPU installations on the planet. 100,000 NVIDIA H100s with plans to scale way beyond that. And now you drop Cursor into that stack and what do you have?
You have the full vertical. Compute, connectivity, and the developer tool that sits on top.
That's the whole game. Musk doesn't want to compete with Microsoft on one product. He wants to build the entire alternative stack. Think about what Microsoft has. Azure for compute, GitHub for the developer platform, Copilot for AI-assisted coding, and the OpenAI partnership for the models underneath. Musk is assembling the mirror image. XAI's Grok for the models, the Memphis cluster for compute, Starlink for connectivity to the edge, and now Cursor for the developer experience layer.
Okay, and I think this is important, Cursor runs on top of other people's models right now. It uses Claude, it uses GPT-4, it's model agnostic. The second you fold it into the Musk empire, doesn't that change? Doesn't it become a Grok-only thing?
That's the existential risk for Cursor's current user base, yeah. And I think Musk probably isn't stupid enough to flip that switch on day one, but the incentives are obvious. You funnel cursors, millions of developers, onto Grok models running on XAI compute. Every keystroke becomes training data. Every code completion becomes revenue that stays in the ecosystem instead of flowing to Anthropic or OpenAI.
Which is exactly what Microsoft did with Copilot and OpenAI. So he's just copying the playbook.
He's copying the playbook, but with one structural advantage Microsoft doesn't have. Microsoft has to negotiate with OpenAI. That relationship is, it's a mess. There's the whole capped profit structure, the board drama, the renegotiation. Musk owns XAI outright. There's no middleman. If he wants Grok optimized specifically for Cursor's code completion pipeline, he just tells his team to do it.
That's a real point. The Microsoft OpenAI thing has always felt like a marriage where both people are already looking at apartments.
Right. And the timing here matters too. GitHub Copilot has the actual number is something like 77 million developers on GitHub total. But Copilot's paid subscriber count has been growing slower than Microsoft would like. Cursor's been eating into that. There's this whole cohort of developers, especially at startups, who switched to Cursor because the AI integration is just better, more contextual, better at understanding full code bases.
So, SpaceX is buying the thing that's already beating GitHub Copilot in the part of the market that matters most. Early adopters, the people who set trends.
And nobody's saying this part either. Cursor's team is tiny. Like, the founding team at Enosphere is maybe 20, 30 people. The engineering density is absurd. Compare that to GitHub Copilot, which has this massive org inside Microsoft. Cursor's doing more with less, which is exactly the kind of company Musk loves to acquire.
Sure, because he can point to it and say, look, my small team is outshipping your 1,000-person division. It's the Tesla autopilot argument all over again.
Same pattern every time.
Here's what bugs me, though. SpaceX is taking on this deal while carrying $23 billion in debt. The IPO hasn't happened yet, and Musk is, the guy is running like 6 companies simultaneously. At what point does the complexity itself become the risk?
That's the bear case, and it's legitimate. But I'd push back a little. SpaceX's revenue, Starlink alone, is reportedly generating north of $7 billion annually now. The launch business is profitable. The government contracts keep coming. $23 billion in debt sounds scary, but the revenue base can service it. The real risk isn't the debt, it's execution. Can SpaceX actually integrate Cursor without breaking what makes Cursor good?
Because that's what always happens with acquisitions like this. Big company buys beloved developer tool, developers flee to the next thing.
It's the classic playbook, Googlebot. How many developer tools has Google acquired and then slowly killed? The graveyard is enormous. But there's a counter argument, which is that Musk's companies tend to operate more independently than typical acquirers. Tesla and SpaceX share almost nothing operationally. Cursor operates like a semi-autonomous unit inside the Musk ecosystem, plugged into XAI's models but otherwise left alone. It could work.
Could work. The 2 most dangerous words in tech M&A.
Fair.
Let me throw something at you. Is $60 billion actually cheap?
I was waiting for someone to say this. Yes, if you believe that AI-assisted coding is going to be a $100 billion plus market, and I think the evidence points that way, then buying the market leader at $60 billion is not crazy. Cursor's growth rate means that by the time this deal actually closes later this year, their ARR could be approaching $1 billion. At that point, you're paying 60x revenue for a company growing 100+% annually in the single most important software category of the next decade.
Okay, but hang on. You said earlier that SpaceX is paying in stock, not cash. So, cheap is relative to what SpaceX shares are actually worth post-IPO.
Right? And it's almost like a meta bet. If SpaceX IPOs at $400 billion and the stock runs to $500 billion in the first year, then the Cursor acquisition effectively cost less in real terms because the currency appreciated. It's acquisition arbitrage. You're using inflated IPO stock to buy a real asset.
Which is exactly what every tech company does in a bubble.
Except SpaceX has actual monopoly-like positions in launch and satellite internet. It's not a bubble if the underlying business is.
That's what they always say. Every time. The underlying business justifies the valuation right up until it doesn't.
I hear you. But name another company that can put a payload in orbit for a fraction of what anyone else charges and also has the largest satellite constellation in history. SpaceX is in a genuinely different category.
Fine. Let me come at this from the Microsoft angle. Satya Nadella wakes up, sees this deal. What's the actual threat level?
High, and here's why. It's not just about Cursor versus Copilot as products. It's about the bundle. Microsoft's entire AI strategy is built on this idea that Azure plus GitHub plus Copilot plus OpenAI is an integrated offering that enterprises can't resist. If Musk builds a competing bundle, XAI models plus Cursor plus whatever compute offering they assemble, suddenly there's a real alternative, and it's being assembled by someone who, love him or hate him, has a track record of actually shipping integrated products.
Does he though? Like, has XAI actually shipped anything that competes with GPT-4 at the enterprise level?
Not yet. That's the weakest link. Grok is interesting. It's improving, but it's not displacing GPT-4 or Claude in enterprise workflows today. But the Memphis supercluster changes the equation. When you have that much compute, you can iterate on models incredibly fast. And if Cursor's user base is generating massive amounts of coding interaction data, that becomes a flywheel for making Grok better at code specifically.
The data flywheel. Every AI deal eventually comes back to the data flywheel.
Because it's real. It's the one thing in AI that isn't hype. The company with the best proprietary data pipeline wins. And Cursor, with millions of developers writing code through it every day, is one of the best data pipelines in existence for code intelligence.
So, here's my contrarian take on this whole thing. Everyone's framing this as SpaceX versus Microsoft. I think the real loser might be Anthropic.
Go on.
Cursor is one of Anthropic's biggest distribution channels right now. Tons of Cursor users are running Claude under the hood. The second Musk takes over and starts shifting the default model to Grok, Anthropic loses a massive chunk of its developer-facing distribution, and Anthropic doesn't have its own coding ID. They're dependent on third parties.
That's a really sharp point, and it extends further. Anthropic's whole business model is API revenue from developers and enterprises. If the most popular AI coding tool switches away from Claude, that's not just a branding loss. That's real revenue gone. And Anthropic's already in this weird position where they're funded by Amazon but competing with everyone. Losing Cursor distribution would hurt.
Who does that actually help? Like, does Anthropic go build their own IDE? Do they try to acquire a competitor to Cursor?
I think what happens is the coding IDE market fragments. You'll have Cursor in the Musk camp, Copilot in the Microsoft camp, and then someone, maybe backed by Anthropic or Google, builds a third option, which honestly might be great for developers. Competition is good.
Unless all three lock you into their model ecosystem, and then competition is just three walled gardens instead of one.
Welcome to platform economics. Same as it ever was.
You said something before about the deal being contingent on the IPO. What happens if the IPO gets delayed? Like, there's all this political uncertainty. Markets are choppy. What if Project Apex doesn't happen on schedule?
The deal terms reportedly include a window. SpaceX has the right to exercise the acquisition through the end of the year. If the IPO slips into next year, it gets murky. Cursor isn't obligated to wait forever, and in the meantime, other suitors could come in. Google could make a play. Amazon could make a play. At $9 billion, Cursor was expensive but acquirable by a lot of companies. At $60 billion, the buyer pool is basically SpaceX, the hyperscalers, and maybe Apple if they ever decided to care about developer tools.
Apple and developer tools. That's a whole other episode.
Don't get me started on Xcode.
Can we talk about what this says about XAI specifically? Because you wrote that one article.
That's not what's happening with the mainstream narrative on XAI. Everyone keeps treating XAI as this separate Musk company that's competing with OpenAI on chatbots. But the Cursor deal reveals what XAI actually is. It's the AI brain that's meant to plug into every other Musk company. Tesla for self-driving, SpaceX for mission planning, and now Cursor for software development. XAI isn't a product company. It's an infrastructure layer.
So when Musk raised, what was it, $6 billion for XAI at a $40 billion valuation?
Yeah, about that range.
He wasn't building a ChatGPT competitor. He was building a shared AI nervous system for his entire portfolio.
And that's either brilliant or terrifying depending on your perspective. Because the concentration of power is, one person controlling the leading rocket company, the leading satellite internet provider, one of the biggest EV companies, a social media platform, and now potentially the most popular AI coding tool, all unified by a proprietary AI stack. There's no historical precedent for that kind of vertical integration across that many industries.
Standard Oil, but for the 21st century.
With rockets.
With rockets. Yeah. So does the FTC even look at this? SpaceX buying a coding tool doesn't trigger any obvious antitrust.
There's zero horizontal overlap. SpaceX doesn't make developer tools. Cursor doesn't launch rockets. The antitrust case is theoretically about vertical integration and data accumulation, but those arguments have historically been almost impossible to win in the US. Europe might squint at it differently, but realistically, this deal sails through regulatory review.
Which is kind of the point of structuring it through SpaceX instead of, say, through XAI directly.
Smart catch. If XAI acquired Cursor, you can make an argument about AI market concentration. But SpaceX, it's a space company buying a software company. The regulatory optics are clean.
That's the whole game right there. Structure the deal through the entity that makes it look most benign.
Corporate Law 101. But yeah,
Alright, last thing. And I want you to be honest about this. Is Cursor actually worth $60 billion? Or is this Musk paying a strategic premium because he needs this piece for his larger chess game?
both. And I don't think those are contradictory. On a pure DCF basis, 60 billion for a company doing maybe 500 million to a billion in ARR is aggressive. But Musk isn't buying a revenue stream. He's buying a distribution channel to millions of developers, a data pipeline for training code models, and a competitive weapon against Microsoft. The strategic premium is real, but the underlying asset is also genuinely exceptional. Cursor's product is best in class. The team is elite. The growth is real. No, actually, the more honest answer is that 60 billion only makes sense if you believe the entire Musk ecosystem thesis. As a standalone acquisition, it's overpaying. As the missing piece of a $300 billion infrastructure play, it might be a bargain.
You said earlier that probably fine and guaranteed are very different things. I feel like that applies to literally every sentence in this deal.
It does. Every single one. But that's kind of the Musk playbook, right? Every bet he makes looks insane at the time and then looks inevitable in retrospect. Or it blows up. There's no middle.
No middle. Just rockets and code editors and $60 billion in stock that may or may not exist yet.
Welcome to 2025.
Welcome to 2025.